series of 6 in an art lecture series. Tonight, we have with us Steve Izenour, who is an associate in the office of Venturi and Rauch. Graduated from Penn in the year 65 with a bachelor's, went on to Yale, graduated from there in 69 with a master's. Since he spent 12 years with Venturi's office and is currently teaching at Penn. Most specifically, the projects he's worked on are the Thousand Oaks Project, Yale Mathematics Building, Basco and Besk buildings, and most recently the Energy Expo 82. As well, Mr. Izenour has worked on the Main Street and Strip architectural studies of Las Vegas and Atlantic City, the work of which is developed into the Signs of American Life exhibit at Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian. He is also the co-author of a book called White Tower. The work that he will be showing tonight is currently on exhibit at the EC Gallery in Venice, and the address there is 66 Windward Avenue. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Izenour.
I don't usually get terribly uptight giving lectures, but bringing the stuff that we usually use in our lectures to the kind of research-related stuff that we juxtapose to the building sometimes back to LA, since all of it comes within about 6 square blocks of right here, is really makes you a little uptight because you all ought to know it a lot better than I do. But at any rate, I'm going to bring it back to you and force you to look at your own neighbors a little bit tonight. And what I thought I'd do is juxtapose some of that more theoretical kind of research-related material with a series of buildings that relate or don't relate to that material. I think that's certainly instructive to you as students, since it's all too easy to get swept up in whatever the latest craze is, or theory, or postmodernism, or whatever it happens to be this month, and kind of get involved in a rather heady intellectual debate, which makes more or less sense, just depending on who's debating, but and end up thinking that that what's really important about these things are what people are saying about them, which hopefully isn't the case. And that kind of transference and relationship between what people say and in fact what they do, I think is the kind of at the heart of the critical process that hopefully you're all going to learn to sift those two out for yourself and be able to weigh one against the other. And so in a sense, I'm giving you your chance to kind of say we did or we didn't, or we did say it and we didn't do it. And I think it's a very valid process that you have to go through, and certainly one that we go through. Because this whole question of, certainly if you read the magazines in the last few years, it does seem that there's a whole debate going on in architecture that seems to exist almost apart from the real buildings. It exists in a very abstruse kind of realm where one group of people talk past another group of people. And maybe we ought to try to get that debate back to some kind of commonsensical level where we can all at least talk about buildings instead of the validity of ideas that haven't been tested. So with no more ado, why don't we kill the lights and get on with the slides. It's really a pleasure to come someplace that I have a couple other apologies to make before I start. One, they really squeeze you out good here at SCI-Arc. They really, I think I've been talking for about 7 hours straight. So if I get, a little incoherent about an hour into this, it's just because I've totally run out of gas. And it's really nice. It's really a pleasure to come someplace that has a big screen. Uh-oh, I hope that isn't what I think it was. You still got slides in the right order? Okay, I'll believe it. However they come, we'll do it. Oh, wait, go back. Sorry, that wasn't a... I'll say next. But starting, you know, I mean, starting with the basic idea and this little throwaway that was done for that very serious endeavor, Roma interruption or whatever, you know, the basis, and you know, it's silly to spend any time on this. I suppose it's all such old hat that everybody knows about it. That you know, that kind of process of that happened in the '60s that Bob and a bunch of other people were involved in, of basically, to a great extent, reassessing the historical European traditions in architecture and making that trip, as you know, as he put it, from Philadelphia to Rome and back again, you know, is a basic element behind a lot of what people are talking about and doing now. The difference being that, in a sense, I have a feeling, at least when I hear a lot of the people, the postmodernists and others talking, that they made the trip from New York or Philadelphia to Rome and didn't bother to come back to Las Vegas or L.A. or wherever they're from. And they're all kind of involved in a very European experience and definition of architecture, when, in a sense, I think much of what we've been doing, certainly since the late 60s, since Levittown and Las Vegas studies, has been, you know, very consciously involved in coming back to right hereabouts and dealing with issues in very basic kind of American terms. It really hasn't been that involved in any kind of European tradition, except in the sense that most American traditions tend to feed off in a very bastardized way from a lot of European sources. Next slide. Now, you know, a lot of this is chronologically, obviously, out of phase in the sense that Las Vegas came first and the Levittown study came second, and then just in the last few months we finished the Atlantic City study, which was basically the urban Main Street study that had always kind of been postulated as being the third piece of this thing, and it just never happened at the time that the other two were done. Because everybody got tired of teaching at that point, and it kind of stopped. And so 10 years later, we finally finished the last piece this fall. But you know, the idea certainly of an image like this, which is, and you know, why we went and looked at this stuff, and what we thought we got from it, was, you know, pretty simple on a couple of levels. It was basically going back to a residential vernacular architecture in this country. This picture is Eastern, but you know, obviously it could be almost any place USA with subtle changes of planning and architecture. To look in an environment in terms of the Levittown study, in terms of the Las Vegas study initially, to look at an environment in which two-dimensional and decorative communication dominated over spatial and kind of formal communication. And in terms of Levittown, to look at an environment where elements of two-dimensional elements, stylistic elements, and personal elements of the people that live in an individual house tend to dominate, again, this kind of traditional, modern, spatial, and formal definitions of the good environment. And now obviously, you know, a certain attempt we had to overcome. In doing this, it had to be a very conscious attempt, because we certainly had to overcome our own prejudice as designers. We're all modern designers and all trained about what's, you know, wrong about this environment, some of which makes a lot of sense, criticisms of this environment in terms of its ecology and just land use and issues like that. And certainly, you know, with what's happening in the last couple of years, it's all going to be, it's a historical object now to a great extent. But aside from those, the exercise was one of saying, was, in a sense, one of trying to deal with your own architectural arrogance, on one level. Since this was, this is the environment, one of, 2 or 3, but certainly when I was a first-year student in the 60s, you were, very quickly, implicitly and explicitly, it was pointed out to you as the one place you should never set foot in again, now that you're training to be a professional designer, because this thing represented a series of values and taste cultures that were considered beyond the pale and absolutely irrelevant to what any serious designer would be involved with or be looking at. And we turned on that. There's nothing, and again, there's nothing particularly new with one group of designers looking at something that everybody's told them is awful, not just out of spite, and there's obviously an element of that in it, I suppose. If you say you can't do it, I'm going to do it. But in terms of, what did they do in the 20s when they rediscovered the industrial vernacular and turned it literally into a style and a method of architecture? We went to this thing not with quite such lofty intentions. We went to it, in a sense, to learn about what was the difference between our values as professionals and the values of, the 99 and 9/10% of other people out there who aren't trained to be professional designers and really don't care a hell of a lot about what we think, and obviously there's a lot more of them than there are of us. Not to say that they're right and necessarily that we're wrong, but just to say that, it seemed to be a good move to try to understand something that was going on out there for all those people before you just kind of threw it aside because it just didn't meet certain criteria that you had for it or certain values that you had. So it was kind of an exercise in cultural liberation, if you will, of trying to get into this thing and begin to understand it. In the process, we began to evolve a kind of methodology that was kind of particular to the types of people that were doing this type of research. None of us were social scientists. None of us were were economists. We really couldn't deal with the kind of hard information that a Herb Gans had worked with and the social scientists were working with on a very effective level. What we could deal with was what we saw, because we were basically a group of people either in training or trained to work with our eyes. And so what we evolved with a system of kind of collecting and categorizing and that was quite systematic in its way, but certainly much more subjective than any social science methodology. Next slide. Now, you couldn't go very far at looking at the residential suburbs without dealing with the historical evolution of these things, and this whole question of, and that's true. That's what, much more true of this and the Atlantic City study than is certainly Las Vegas, which was basically instant history. The historical side of Las Vegas had to have pretty long analogies and comparisons, given its separation in time and distance from just about anything else, and given the fact that it was just kind of instant city, with all of a 20 or 30 years history. But when you're dealing, the obvious place and the role of history in dealing with the residential imagery is just absolutely primary, because you're dealing with something that's been going on, for almost forever. People are always living in something, and what they do with that something, is part of a historical continuum that tells you a lot about what they're going to do tomorrow with it. And so certainly an image like this, that's of, kind of the classic ex-urban, idealized, very romantic rural image, again, an Eastern image, but one that you can find with different variations all over this country, represents that kind of idealized rural image that has been absolutely dominant in our cultural history. you know, and it's created certainly all kinds of problems for us in relation to our cities, because we really, as a culture, do tend to assign all the righteous moral values to this type set of images, and all the bad things to the urban environment. There's a lot of good reasons for that in terms of, you know, the people that founded this country, but it's this, so, you know, by looking at this type of image, it's winding country, the, you know, the wildflowers in the meadow, the little tree nestled in the house, you know, this type of cultural image, which I suppose is ingrained in most of us by the time we're 4 or 5, you know, becomes a very powerful thing in conditioning the way we expect our homes to look for the rest of our lives. Next slide. In the representation of some of those images that we did in 1976 for the Signs of Life show in Washington, we took a stab at trying to articulate some of those meanings, some of those layers of symbols and kind of cultural meaning to the average museum goer. We did it with a series of kind of 3 typical American homes, this one being obviously the typical Levittown subdivision, in which, with the cartoon blurbs, we started to try to point out to people, some of them in a humorous way, some not, some of the symbolic sources for the things that they do, consciously and, well, it's all done very consciously, obviously, since a lot of this stuff people actually do for themselves, and they have to make a choice. But they don't necessarily, the interesting thing, of course, about these types of architectural symbols is that, one, you don't really have to know the total source in order for them to be an effective symbol. You don't have to trace, you know, the garden ornaments of Versailles back historically in order to use them. That symbols tend to, you know, just keep appearing and reappearing, and it's kind of where, it's the context in which they appear that conditions to some extent how people then will reuse them. And the fact that they're, quote, used wrongly or used, you know, incorrectly, it becomes almost irrelevant in terms of the kind of cultural message. It's very relevant in terms of a pure architectural message or pure architectural value that any of us would, you know, have to operate with as conscious designers. But in terms of their function in an overall cultural, as an overall cultural symbol, or something that has meaning to an awful lot of people, those little subtleties become relatively irrelevant to the power and the effectiveness of the thing to communicate. So the point here wasn't to say that, you know, this guy used this symbol system well or badly, as much as to connect all these 3 different houses to each other, and they were all very different and obviously represented very different income and social groups. But we were trying to go for the things that, the common things that they had with each other, rather than the things that separated them. Next slide. Each one of these houses had its own interior as well that went with it. This was obviously your kind of comfortable indoor-outdoor life in your typical suburban home, with the family just gotten up and went into the kitchen for a snack on commercials or something, and you know, it represents obviously a certain style of life that's rather basic to a big part of this country, I suppose, and a lot of the objects, you know, were part of that. It wasn't as successful as an aesthetic object, I guess. Since we designed all these, I can be critical of them, I guess. Since none of us grew up in the suburbs, this was a very difficult room for us to do. We had to basically research it at Sears and Levitt's, and rather than the real thing, because, you know, hardly any of it turned out hardly any of us really knew anybody that lived in a suburban house, or had ever known anybody that lived in a suburban house. And you know, it's one thing to drive down the street and take pictures of 5,000 suburban houses. It's another thing to walk up the front door and ring the bell and ask to come in and check out their symbols. You know, you just aren't going to get very far doing that sort of thing. So, you know, we really were flying kind of blind, and in some ways I think this room ended up a bit dry a bit like it's really a Levitt showroom rather than somebody's real living room. We got one dig in, obviously, with the pole light, the Bauhaus survival item there, which was, you know, in one level, I think is probably a very realistic appraisal of the effect up to this date of the modern style on, you know, the typical American home. You know, there's maybe one or two objects, and maybe something in the bathroom and something in the kitchen and a pole light, you know, that are the sum total of the effect of a lot of what modern architects have been talking about for the last 40 and 50 years. Next slide. This was the version of it that was reduced to your typical 19th century Philadelphia row house street. And interestingly, you know, that the symbols didn't change. Now, you know, if you, as a modern designer, you'd say, well, those beautiful ideal rural symbols belong and were created to meet a, you know, certain style of life in relation to the country. They really don't belong in this urban environment. You would find another set of things that worked here. But of course, symbols aren't spatially or formally related once they're out there floating around that way. All that happens is that people adapt the same rural imagery, kind of idealized rural imagery, down to, you know, 6 inches on a row house instead of 60 feet on a suburbs or 600 feet out in the country. The symbols have just become kind of squeezed and adapted to a much more two-dimensional urban form. Certainly this type of housing type can't help but be an eye-opener, I think, for the typical modern architect. It was kind of the ultimate kind of mass-produced, you know, every block after block, all the same when it was built 100 years ago or so. And they were just, you know, acres and acres of this stuff all over major eastern cities, kind of workers' housing. But look what happens to it over time. You take this very rigid, spatial, and formal definition of what a house is, and there's hardly anything more rigid. And over time, as people begin to alter and customize their own environment, you know, these things take on tremendous variety, literally a variety that would be impossible, just humanly impossible for any group of designers to predetermine or to kind of design into it. You know, one guy was doing his quilted stainless windows, another person their AstroTurf stoop, and somebody else their bay window, and somebody else their permastone. You get this tremendous richness and variety within a very limited form with very minimal means. This isn't to say that that lesson, when you discover this kind of lesson, that therefore you run out and start doing homes with that kind of variety in them. That's a bit presumptuous. The lesson is one of that in certain situations, designing for certain people, particularly in a mass housing situation, there's perhaps a lot of things you just leave undone to a certain extent, or you assume are going to be done and you're going to have no control over. But knowing that fact and not trying to, you know, control certain issues, or designing a house that's going to look great in 25 different varieties 10 years from now, is kind of a negative lesson that's perhaps a very important one to learn. Next slide. This was obviously the living room that went with the Philadelphia 2 Street row house. And this was a room, this in a lot of ways was the room that if we had to make an aesthetic choice, which I just said a minute ago we weren't doing with these, this was the room that we found the most successful as an aesthetic object in a lot of ways. It's certainly the room that we knew the best, and maybe that was part of its success, because there were a lot of people in the office that knew people that lived in a house like this, or grew up in families that had a house like this, and we had aunts and uncles and grandparents kind of, you know, as consultants, and borrowed knickknacks and bowling trophies and you name it to really get a sense of this as a room. And, you know, in the sense of it as a successful aesthetic object, I guess our pleasure with it was that it was the room that took the greatest chances, in a sense, that had the widest range of kind of, quote, incongruous objects juxtaposed to each other, and, you know, just barely held together, in a sense, as a totality, as an overall design. And that kind of wild kind of almost Baroque combination of objects was to us, the most interesting and the kind of the most lively as an aesthetic object compared to the certain static quality involved in the other two. Next one. Now, another thing that we spent a lot of time looking at in the mid-70s was something very close to home here, obviously, to all of you, and something that, a housing type that certainly had a pretty profound effect on a lot of the smaller houses that we've done in the last decade. In our terms, I guess the West Coast, or the bungalow of the West Coast and the Southwest, although they're really all over the country, you just have more of them than most people. New Jersey's about the only state in the East that really has a large number of them. But it represents the kind of the West Coast version of that row house that I was just showing. It's kind of, it was definitely a kind of a mass-produced thing. Your kind of minimal housing unit, except now they cost $200,000 here, I hear. But at one time it was a minimal housing unit that, with most of the plans pretty similar, some kind of very simple double-loaded single-story plan, in which the designers, and who they are I really don't know. I assume that a lot of these were probably done out of plan houses in Chicago and all over the country, where you mailed in your $50 and got your set of plans and gave them to the builder, and he built you a house. But it's a type. In other words, it's kind of your irreducible little housing package. Absolutely dumb, simple, meeting kind of basic needs at a minimal cost. But the interesting thing, of course, is the immense variety. And of course, because it is a freestanding house, it's a variety of a different sort from the row house, which was, an attached house. It's a variety of applied style. It's a variety of characteristic profile that kind of sets up the image or the meaning of that style. It's extremely sophisticated manipulations of scale and proportion in the way porches and windows and doors are put into these things. In total, it's got to be, at least to us as outsiders who don't see these every day and have to go out of our way to look at them, I guess we really see this as one of the most sophisticated exercises in American design in the 20th century. They are absolutely, as a group, in toto, you just never seem to run out of finding another amazing one that's more sophisticated than the last one in its manipulation of style and scale. And the presence of these things as they sit on the street, the way they sit on the street is just, it's just nothing quite like it any place in the world. Next slide. I always got to put up a couple of my favorites because, again, it's something that we really feel very close to and have spent an awful lot of time kind of staring at. Most of these are Northern California, rather, in this area. This is up around Alameda. But, the one on the left, certainly you see that, the absolute simple moves, but very sophisticated moves that make this thing have such tremendous monumentality for such a little object on the street, and how it commands its street, especially when it's block after block of them. Just the simple profile of the pitched roof, the big scale opening of the porch, a few little, very abstract and kind of reductive stylistic elements, and then the beautiful scale of the windows. It's just an extremely sophisticated design object. Next one. Or this one, the absolute biggest scale little package I think anybody's ever done. That's all of, I don't know, 15, 16 feet wide. Next slide. Now, switching to some of our houses, this is a house of a few years back that certainly has some tinges of that interest and kind of love for the American bungalow. And although it's, in a lot of ways it has very little to do with the American bungalow in terms of its location or its function, but there's certain lessons about scale and the use of kind of very simple cultural images about what one building is versus another, which those little houses do so beautifully and so sophisticatedly, because the power of those things, in a sense, is that the image of them, even though they're numerous and in many different styles, and I can have, you know, Alice in Wonderland or Tudor or whatever, you know, green and green, whatever I want, the basic image of all of those styles, in a sense, is that of kind of the child's drawing of the idea of a house. You know, it's a box with a pitched roof and some holes in it and a chimney and a door. And that kind of irreducible image, the ultimate abstract house that says house to almost anybody in our culture, I suppose, with absolutely, without, you know, without a thought, gives the power of that. And that isn't, it isn't saying that and we certainly aren't saying that powerful cultural image is the only way to design a house. It isn't. I mean, there's a lot of ways to design a house, and the modern symbol system, which is quite different from that cultural symbol system, at least at this point, is an equally valid way of designing a house. It's just a question that in certain situations, the power of that cultural symbol to communicate to so many people, in a sense, imbues the smallest objects with tremendous importance, which it doesn't necessarily have when you're using a more kind of abstract or erudite system that isn't understood by a lot of people. So again, the choice of which system you want to use at any given time is obviously a very free choice and up to the designer. But to understand, all we're doing in this process and all that's coming out of something on one level of all that kind of research is an understanding of the uses of those more commonly accepted symbol systems at the right time and the right place. Now, in this sense, certainly, as I said, it's not a suburban house. It's the ultimate young bachelor's vacation pad in exurban Westchester County. It's meant to be used 2 days a week, on Saturday and Sunday. He was a young writer, wanted to get away from Manhattan. And so programmatically, it becomes a very different animal. It's kind of your ultimate custom situation, the one-on-one between the architect and a very sophisticated, articulate client who basically set down his whole program in an extended essay that he gave to us that he worked on for a month. And it was an essay just full of images and kind of, projections of how he'd like to live. One of the dominant ones being the idea of tree house, and he wanted to be up in the trees in this beautiful site and all that sort of thing. And certainly, it was that kind of the ultimate one-on-one custom design situation. Programmatically, it became totally inverted in the sense that, the sleeping and eating spaces are in the bottom of the house and the living space in the top. The reverse of the normal situation, due to the fact, again, that this is a house that's not lived in on a daily basis. It's basically a place where you come for the distilled, heightened thing for a couple days, and so you don't want to miss anything. You're at night, you don't really care. You bury the bedrooms. And so you give over to the daytime living areas, all the prime locations, and everything else suffers as a result because it's basically a 36-hour house. Next slide. Now the power of that child's drawing, I think, is pretty obvious. That what you're dealing with is, again, that very simple diagram on one level, but only one level, of the box, the roof, the door punched in the wall, the windows with muttons and mullions that looked like representational windows. But obviously, the way those very representational objects have been manipulated are very personal and have a lot more to do with modern architecture than they do with any traditional form this thing might come from. So while the overall kind of the basic symbol of the thing is, dealing with those generalities, the specifics are very much those of a modern designer, not you know, somebody, not a bungalow designer, let's say. Next. Now, as you went into this thing, you know, it was a very tight, I don't have the plan tonight, but it was a very tight plan. The whole house is about 22 feet square, 25 feet square, with just your, you know, space for 2 people, 2 bedrooms, a little kitchen, and there wasn't even any room for a dining room. Basically, he didn't want a dining room. He said he'd eat in the front hall, and basically behind you is a little table that can seat 2 people by the front door where he eats his, where he would eat. And then going up the very tight little stair, kind of jammed behind all the services. Next slide. You come out in the reason for the whole thing, which is, you know, the dramatic big room in the roof and his tree house, in effect, projecting him out into the trees. The whole thing tinted a very subtle green. And then obviously the light for a lot of the year filtered through the green of the trees, giving the whole thing kind of a very green tint and the feeling of being up in the trees. Now, you know, there's elements of that are certainly, as I said, have a lot more to do with a modern tradition than they do with any bungalow tradition. Certainly the actual size of these windows, you know, that when you're up close to them, while at a distance they were representational as being kind of everyday windows, obviously they're, you know, at the size of sliding doors, and they're really at the scale of a more modern window wall, even though the shape is traditional. So what you've done is play with the idea, modern concepts of indoor, outdoor, the glass wall, all those kind of ideas, which are certainly very valid ideas, but kind of temper it with a more traditional idea of a room that has solid corners, 4 solid corners, where there's a definite sense of kind of height and dimension and scale given by the way the thing is detailed and put together, and certainly helped along by the types of objects this guy wanted to put in it. So that at the one time, while you're playing with rather traditional modern games of scale and indoor and outdoor relations, you're still preserving a much more traditional sense of a room with definite limits. This is certainly, I think, overcome some of the problems of the traditional modern space that, you know, does the great dissolving of inside and outside. Because while that dissolving very often is very effective in the daytime, it becomes pretty oppressive in the at night. The traditional room with 4 walls and a ceiling and a floor very often is much more effective at night than a modern definition of a room or a space. Next slide. And then, of course, as you turn back on yourself, you've got the fireplace playing with that kid's drawing again of the idea of a house, and his library tucked above that up in the peak of the roof. Next. Now, shifting locale and scale completely from a house for 2 people, basically, to in the woods, to a house for 20 people on Bermuda, you get, and again, a house that has this, you know, has absolutely nothing to do with Levittown, either from where it is. The only thing that connects with that, some of that research stuff we looked at the beginning, is the idea of becoming sensitive and aware to context and surroundings and certain traditions that you find for domestic architecture wherever they happen to be, whether it's Levittown or the British colonial tradition in Bermuda. That once you've started to kind of force yourself to deal with things for a certain amount of time the way they are and the way they've been before you begin postulating the way they should be, you begin to acquire certain sensibilities that you otherwise might not have. That's the only connection, just the one of method rather than one of appearance, since the appearance obviously changes with the locale, in this case for sure. And what we're dealing with here is a very expensive house for a very rich client who lives a very formal and very elaborate style of life that none of us know probably very personally. It's one that has a lot more to do with the 19th century than it certainly does with the typical house in the 20th century. It's one in which the whole left wing of that plan is nothing but servants. In other words, a third of the total house, is basically downstairs and backstairs. And it's a house that comes out of that kind of wonderful fusion that the British did so well in the 18th and 19th century, when the empire was really zipping, when they took their a whole series of architectural styles and housing types and public building types, some of it Regency, some of it Georgian, many different styles, and transported these forms to the tropics and the outposts of the empire, and then adapted these very traditional forms to the new environment that they were in. And out of that came some absolutely fabulous architecture. Some of the basic things that obviously happened is that certainly in this climate was that houses that had great depth in their original version in Britain were thinned out and turned into pavilions, and in order to get cross ventilation, you never tried to have more than one room in depth. You were constantly trying to open the houses through. You were getting a lot of elements of, developing a lot of elements of shading, but all within a very definite architectural style that came from a very different set of constraints. And this kind of transference, of one set of architectural meanings to a totally different context, created a very interesting architecture, and a very successful, and successfully met the objects of working in a totally new climate, at the same time looking like a little bit of home, which was obviously important for people who basically left their home for most of their lives. The site itself is extremely dramatic kind of site on a very steep cliff looking down to the ocean. And so in this very early sketch, one of the basic ideas of the house was one of being able to, as you enter the house, to look straight out to the ocean and down through the house. This kind of inversion pragmatically of the upstairs becoming the downstairs was also used effectively here, again, because of the nature of vacation life, the fact that you want to appreciate the best views during the day and for the limited time you're there. So all the bedrooms go down in the basement, in effect, and all the living space gets the prime upper levels. The middle wing, the center wing, basically with the formal dining room on the left, the large-scale stairs straight ahead taking you down to the bedrooms below, and then the master bedroom suite getting the absolute prime corner of the upstairs wing with its informal family sitting room and bedroom behind, and then the formal living room over on the extreme right, all 25 by 45 feet of it or something. It's really a kind of housing on a grand scale that certainly is not typical of most houses that most of us do. Next slide. Now this house, again, this idea of dealing with a set of commonly accepted cultural images within this context was something that was done very consciously at a distance. So as you looked at this thing as an overall composition, it really did, to a certain extent, look like it had been sitting there for the last 90 or 100 years, that it had all the tile roofs all whitewashed with the pole gutters carrying the water down to the cistern, and the cedar trim, and the kind of Regency detailing that we picked up for this particular style, particular house. And the idea of as you came into the formal forecourt, of the different pavilions kind of sliding and crashing into each other, which was a bit more abrupt than the traditional version of this, and obviously having a bit more to do with the 1970s than the 1870s. Next slide. As you came in much closer, again, the question was one of a lot of period detailing, a lot of it a bit overscaled, but certainly the type of thing that was appropriate to deal with the way these people that were going to furnish this house, basically with 18th century English antiques, any two of which are probably worth more than the whole house. But there's another very strange thing about these pictures, that it has a very unlived-in quality, and these were taken about 18 months after the house was finished, and I think they'd lived in it all of 2 weeks by that time. And so it is this very strange kind of surreal quality to it that is typical of a house that nobody's really ever moved into, I think. They've kind of camped there for a couple weeks. There's no books in the bookcases and no magazines and no nothing. It's just a series of furniture dropped down in a series of rooms. Next one. Or here are the view looking straight ahead and out towards the ocean down the stairs. Again, with all the using cedar for most of the trim. Again, this was a very traditional combination of materials that was done in these houses in the late 19th century. Next slide. Or here in the master, in the formal living room, again with its big pitched roof, the tie bars, because you're dealing with basically a masonry bearing wall with a tiled roof. Next slide. Or again, moving back into the living room, looking back out onto the porch and out to the ocean. So, you see a shift, I think, in detailing in this type of house between, at a very small scale, using very traditional detailing, albeit a tad over-scaled. At a middle scale, there are a series of relationships inside and out that are really much more modern than traditional. And then at the kind of the image scale of the view of the thing from a great distance, again shifting back to a very traditional set of images that will make this thing look like it's been there forever, basically. Next slide. Then moving out onto the porch, again back more into the traditions of all the French doors opening out onto the porches to get air circulating constantly through the house from side to side, albeit the scale of Palladian windows and the columns themselves, again having more to do with the 19th century and Venturi and Rauch than they do with the 18th century model for this house. Next slide. Or finally, again, moving away to the middle distance, where it really does become much more of a modern house done by a modern designer. Obviously, the scale of that window, which isn't one of the windows that's seen from the front or the back, it's kind of an incidental side elevation, is very much, it might be the image of a traditional window, but certainly the scale is totally that of a 20th century designer. Next slide. And then again, of course, as you move further away from it, you go back to much more to that romantic, traditional image of the Bermuda hill town. This is as all the different pavilions with their different roofs and the cistern with its roof all kind of clash together, getting that very romantic kind of roofscape, which is so typical of a hillside in Bermuda. Next slide. And again, from their private beach, becomes even more traditional with the bedrooms below, with their arched openings, shading the bedrooms and the porch above, and the servants, pavilion, and the kind of living room lost to your left, around to your left. Next slide. Now shifting, completely to a totally different set of images and traditions. This is the house that I've been doing for my parents for the last year. I guess everybody has to try to do a house for their parents once. That kind of endless process of self-education for everybody. They never really trust you. I suppose with a good reason. They know you too well. But this is a little house. I really don't have much on to show you on the site. It's kind of very much in progress right now. but it's a little house, kind of retirement house on a very dramatic site sitting on Long Island Sound. And again, obviously, it has a lot to do with some of those bungalow lessons, if you will, of the simple kind of representational profile, a couple of very representational elements, albeit given a rather idiosyncratic scale. I don't know how the neighbors are going to react to the world's biggest captain's wheel, but that's basically the elevation, the entry elevation, with the garage below. The whole house basically had to be raised one level because this is a hurricane-prone site where about every 5 years all those walls are going to break away down there and the water is going to go right on through. Or if it doesn't go right on through, the house is going to go with it. And so you basically had to do well, it's a one-story house. It had to be raised up quite high on finger supports, kind of a whole series of piers going down into the rock below. And it's a dramatic site in the sense that you really are going to feel, you're right on the edge of the water. The view from up in this big living room looking through the columns is one of literally feeling like you're on the bridge of a ship, kind of, because you really, given the heights you're at and the angle at which you look out, you really won't see any land between you and the water. And it's, very simple little house, kind of 2 bedrooms, a dining room kind of arranged more or less symmetrically around a tight center core with the entry stairs up from below and the world's biggest and fattest column that wants to be a chimney up there. Next slide. Now, these have been published once, I guess. You might have seen these. They were published in France about, I don't know, 6 months ago. And these houses, this is a series of houses, or one house with a series of suits of clothes that was done more for rhetorical and didactic purposes than I suppose ever really anybody really seriously expecting anybody to build it. And it's your basic kind of irreducible little vacation house program of the living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen. And it was done basically, the whole thing was done one weekend in response to I don't know who, but somebody's latest extreme statement about the wonders of the new postmodernism. And I guess everybody about had it with that and was a bit fed up. And so everybody kind of joshing got together and said, well, what could we do? Nobody wanted to write anything because the more you write, the more trouble you get into and the more other people write, and it's an endless circle. And so we kind of figured, well, everybody got together and said, well, let's do a house that kind of is some kind of rhetorical statement to perhaps what our point of view is vis-a-vis the possibility of that one now can work in has this wonderful new opportunity to work in all these different styles and be a Beaux-Arts architect and whatever you want to be, if it moves you in that direction. So it basically started out as a rather serious little Doric temple here. Next slide. I think these are a little out of order, so it might be. Whoops. Yeah, this must be where you dropped them. Keep going. That was an early version of the last one. Before that, that's the site. Okay. Yeah. Well, here we're back to the plan for that irreducible little vacation house. Obviously, your basic 750 square foot vacation house here in its rather serious little temple form. Next slide. Whoa, you really, there's something, you ought to have a whole series of versions of that little house. Well, look a little, keep that, don't throw that one away though, because we're going to come back to it. Now, then we started going through a series of versions of that house. There's one slide that ought to be in here before that, and that was the idea of the first rather serious temple that you could have a serious temple front with a ordinary temple behind. And this was the extraordinary temple front with the ordinary something behind, the kind of Venturi and Rauch Doric, which is kind of fatter and bigger than anybody else's Doric. Or, you know, if you weren't into that, it might have been fat and big, but it was pretty skinny too, in plan underneath. But if you weren't into that, you could kind of have Queen Anne shingle style. Next slide. Oh, there it is. That's your serious front and your ordinary behind. Next slide. And if you weren't into that, you could kind of have your fortification front and your Art Nouveau front. Next, you can just keep these coming. They're each worth about 10 seconds. Or your Egyptioid or your High Renaissance. Next. Or your shingles, or your little bungalow, or your Frankfurt High Victorian. Next slide. Or, you know, the grandfather of them all, you know, you could have your Big Mac. Now, you know, there was about 10 more of these too. They went on, you can, and on, but everybody got one in at least. And you know, it certainly was kind of meant to be humorous and kind of funny and kind of tongue-in-cheek. The only serious comment, I think, to it, which isn't a very dramatic one, but is, I guess, kind of the position we find ourselves taking now vis-a-vis this whole, all these, quote, new liberated possibilities, with obviously somebody like Bob had a lot to do with liberating, but finds himself in the position, certainly, of, you know, oh God, you know, why did I ever do that? To a certain extent, with looking at some of the results. But, you know, given that one doesn't have any power over ideas once they're kind of floating around out there, I think that, you know, the comment here is one that while it's possible to do all these things, and always in a sense has been possible to do all these things, that one can make a couple mistakes in doing it, or in one's attitude in attempting to do it. One mistake is that you can be too utterly consistent about it, that you can make the same mistake that was the criticism in the 60s of the classic modern designer, that he was being so reductive in the nature of his vocabulary of how to do architecture that he was, in a sense, you know, getting himself into logical binds with certain types of buildings. That, you know, he was forcing the building to, or the program or whatever, to fit the image or the style in which he felt comfortable in working, and would get himself into trouble. That one can make by going from that extreme of saying that you can only make architecture one way to an extreme that says you can only make architecture another way over here, whether it's Beaux-Arts or whatever it happens to be, is equally reductive and equally logically going to get you in the same mess. That the position is one of saying not that you got to do it all that way or all this way. The kind of commonsensical position would seem to be one of saying that, you know, all these things are possible, and I can do, if it's relevant and necessary to do, you know, a certain Beaux-Arts move here, I don't have to be, just because I did it up front, or if I did, you know, Frankfurt in front, I don't have to be utterly consistent with it and do it all the way through and do the plan that way and do the back that way. That I can kind of pick and choose and recombine the elements of the architectural vocabulary in the way that suits, you know, the situation or the context or whatever it happens to be in a very flexible sort of way. Now, obviously, I have to make all that work and come together on some formal and visual level, and that has to do with the skill of the designer, and no theory ever, you know, ever took that problem on. But, you know, in other words, it's looking for kind of a moderate middle position. Of course, the problem with some of the rhetoric is that the rhetoric is basically, or some of the people using the rhetoric are basically trying to say that, you know, having had one revolution, you know, 40 or 50 years ago, it's now time to have yet another revolution, I have a feeling that's very bad history, that you only have so many revolutions, and then you have kind of evolution after a revolution. And what we're saying, in a sense, that we're in an evolutionary period of kind of minor little shifts, minor little changes of what, is adding to things that you threw away 40 years ago. And so we're very much in a kind of a moderate middle position and not in any kind of revolutionary stance at all. Next slide. Well, we ought to try put that one back of the strip of the exhibit with the McDonald's arches. There we are. Now, shifting away from the residential design, we come to dear old Las Vegas and LA and all that. In the Renwick, certainly, we put together a series of objects in a way that didn't have a heck of a lot to do with the way we perceive them, certainly on a day-to-day basis. You were asked to look at a billboard from 6 feet and a lot of very beautiful signs from about 6 to 10 feet. There was a complete shift in the aesthetic distance of these whole things, of all these things and all these objects. And that was done with a certain malice of forethought, because we were very definitely trying to make people see these things out of context and begin to judge them as, in a sense, as a modern designer always judges objects as, by taking them out of their context, putting them into, so you could look at them as kind of formal objects as well as, functional objects, as they all were designed for very specific functions and very, specific roadside scale. And certainly by the choice and selection of the objects, we were making some very definite comments about some of the same criticisms, if you will, about the vocabulary and of the modern graphic designer that were made in the 60s about modern architects. That by over-reducing the vocabulary from, down to 1 or 2 typefaces and 3 colors and a group of symbols, rather abstract symbols, that we were in effect kind of limiting the potential for interesting visual vitality in the roadside environment. We were kind of stripping away most of the things that made this thing really interesting to look at and really make a lot of understandable for a lot of people. You were kind of, you were very consciously picking the flying red horse instead of the flying red O. And, asking people to ask themselves, in a sense, was that really an improvement to, get rid of the flying red horse in place of a big red O? Does the O really do more than the beautiful representation of the horse with its symbolism and, everything that goes with it in terms of the ornamental scale on which it was built? Was something lost in that process that perhaps, ought to be some attempt made to try to bring it back in? Now, our architectural purpose, that's kind of a preservationist purpose or a critical purpose in selection of objects and learning to appreciate certain objects. And certainly, again, by the choice of these, we were saying, to some extent, perhaps, at least in our terms, we see some of these objects as 50 years from now, people looking back and seeing these as some, of the great indigenous American decorative art objects of this era. And they'll all be gone, certainly, because it's a very perishable medium. But it's, they are absolutely, some of the most elegant modern materials. The whole decorative qualities, these things, apart from whatever their functional use is just, unlike anything else that anybody's been able to pull off, certainly in the 20th century. And so, they are objects with intrinsic value in themselves. But apart from that, certainly, we didn't, when we were studying this stuff, we had no jobs to design any of these things, and it's only in the last 18 months that we've really even gotten the opportunity to begin to play with any of these ideas or any of these objects. So it was pretty much of, as was stated in the book all those years ago, that, it was a group of architects trying to look at an environment in terms of trying to learn how to deal with decoration, explicit decoration, color, and representation in a very two-dimensional form. And that came out of a type of building that we postulated was a type of building that we were going to have to do more and more. You know, a rather simple, straightforward structure, the decorated shed, the whole idea of the decorated shed, the simple, straightforward building that gets its meaning and communication out of what's done two-dimensionally to the outside of it. Next slide. The fact of going and looking at it, trying to understand something about how it worked, was in no sense meant as you know, kind of carte blanche stamp of approval on this as the ideal American environment. Anything but. But what we were saying is it was the one place where we could learn to deal with some of these issues in our own architecture if the opportunity came along. And that was a very big if. Next slide. And, you know, certainly in pictures like this, I mean, I think, the interesting thing about a picture like this, I think, in a lot of ways, that if it was would be what it would mean if we, you know, just changed the language on all those things. It would be, you know, some fabulous piece of kind of abstract expressionism, you know, color, form, and it would be absolutely meaningless to most of us. We wouldn't know what was going on at all. And it, you know, that simple idea that the fact that you read a certain language, that the meaning of those words that you read do have certain, you know, meanings and layers of meanings, that it has them for all of us and with a lot of variation. The power of that, of the word to communicate information and subtle shadings and some not so subtle shadings, you know, that power is very often in a lot of situations where you're functioning as a designer more effective than anything you can do with space or form. That isn't to say that it's that's all you do, that you just deal with words and you cease dealing with space and form. Never said that. We just said that that's another one, that's another way of getting across to people a certain set of information as well as space and form. Next slide. Now, for years, that stuff's 10, 12 years old now, and we really have done, you know, very little that has anything whatsoever to do with it. Except for 2 projects way back in the early 70s, well, 3. There was the Thousand Oaks competition back around 69 or 70, just up the road a piece, and then there were 2 projects for the Bicentennial. The first, a project for a World's Fair in Philadelphia, a project with an interesting history in the sense that it's had about a 4 years run. It had about 6 different designs in about every imaginable site in Philadelphia. And it started out as a mega structure down in Center City and ended up as a strip out by the airport, which is, I suppose, which is probably a pretty telling comment about the power of the megastructure to transform our American cultural values. The basic problem, of course, was that nobody wanted to live. Megastructures are great, except you just didn't want to be the guy who lived next door to one. And so, in effect, the fair ended up down in or what was going to be a fair ended up in the marshes by the airport. At which point, we came up in, you know, a squat that went along and was carried out in Philadelphia for about 3 or 4 weeks, which involved Con and Jurgla and Bob and a whole bunch of people kind of sitting there and kind of knocking around ideas about how we could do a World's Fair and what it would look like, and with a whole bunch of younger guys sitting behind them, watching them all pick each other to death. This was a fun process in the sense that, you know, we were all just a few years out of school and had all been, you know, have taken our knocks in those years, and it was really fun to watch all of them eat each other alive, and not take it any better than any of us did when they did it to us. But but it was probably the last great squat of the Philadelphia School of Architecture, and it lasted about 3 weeks. It was too bad it didn't go on videotape or something, because it would be a classic for historians 100 years from now, because everybody was there and everybody was doing his thing. And everybody was eating each other alive. But our basic, you know, some of the ideas about, and again, quite a bit removed, about how you organize a very large-scale thing, like a strip or a fair, to make it understandable, obviously came out of that work a few years before this. The idea of the one-point perspective of the street, that things are to the left or the right, nobody can get lost, it's either up the street or down the street. That started out in this very early kind of conceptual drawing model one night, and then over a couple days became more realistic in the site plan to the left. The whole thing inflected slightly to give it a bit more romantic scale and a bit more of a kind of regional scale in this terms of, given that it was right at the foot of the airport landing strip, so you'd see this great curve kind of sweeping across towards the river. And then the idea of in the design of a fair, the important things are really the places to sit and get out of the sun and all these kind of small-scale events that really have more to do with whether people have a good time at a fair than the architecture. And in fact, this scheme, assuming, just as on the strip, that everybody's doing his own building, you really don't give a damn, because all you're trying to control as the overall designer is this public scale stuff in the middle, the communications, getting information, going to the bathroom and sitting down. And of course, then since we wanted to get our kicks too, we had to have the world's biggest billboard to go along with our Main Street USA. Next slide. Now, thanks to the Vietnam War, and that's probably really thanks, because probably World's Fairs like that are really pretty much of an absurd undertaking in the best of times. But since, at that point in time, the Vietnam War took all the money for that, the city was then left a few months later having to deal with some of the existing sites in Philadelphia that they wanted to use for the Bicentennial. And we were charged to look at the idea of the great City Beautiful axis from City Hall out to the Art Museum. And again, it was a question of coming up with a program for this place to make it a kind of neat festival place to be at night. It was only to be used at night since this is one of the main commuting links into and out of the city, so it basically was a space that was supposed to be used after 6. And the idea was that you couldn't build anything. This was a rather complete Beaux-Arts design with its 2 great termination points. You really didn't want to put things in the middle of this or even put much along the edge of it. And so you looked to the idea that certainly you learned from looking at a place like Las Vegas, that by using light you can create tremendous impact and scale at night that has absolutely no form whatsoever during the day. And so out of this came an idea like this of projecting the great diagonal, this great diagonal exception in the city up into the sky at night, using the art museum kind of as a backdrop to be projected on, and then kind of trundling a whole lot of little things and events out into the street itself. Next. Now, in the last 6 months, there's been another version of those. Those last 2 schemes are 7 or 8 years old now, really. This was something that was done in this year for the U.S. Pavilion for Expo 82. This is one of those limited expos, and it's going to be in Knoxville phase 2 type or something like that they call it. It's like Spokane. It's basically they build a national pavilion and then a lot of rentable pavilion space that's rented out to other countries and other exhibitors. It's not a full-scale international exposition. And the national pavilion of the host country basically becomes the symbolic object for the whole fair. They last about 6 months, and they're supposed to have some very specific theme around which they're focused. This one was focused around the idea of the energy theme. It was a very difficult site in the sense that it was kind of an old holler that runs down to the Tennessee River along one side of downtown Knoxville, an old railroad yard sunk down in this valley. And the U.S. Pavilion site was located about halfway down in this thing, and basically from one wall of the valley to the other. This thing had a very complex reuse program that was, in a sense, 10 times bigger than the actual fair use. It was supposed to be converted into an energy research laboratory or a GSA office building. They never could quite figure out which. So they said do both. This is one of these things basically where they picked 5 firms from their standard selection process and pay you a pittance to go and do a schematic, at which point everybody burns it out and spends a fortune and, and takes a bath. Oh, another little wrinkle in this was design the energy lab, design the office building, design a 6-month fair, and while you're at it, please do something about designing a U.S. energy policy, because we're having a little trouble with that too. All in 4 weeks, just your basic little problem there. And architects being architects, of course you take it on, because why couldn't you do the U.S. energy policy, right? The architectural ego knows no limits of practicality on little problems like that. And our basic analysis was one of that very quickly in the process it seemed like the last thing you wanted to build was a building on this site. The minute you build any kind of large-scale structure across this valley, you were in effect damming up all when you looked at the environmental impact statement for the fair, you were in effect creating a dam for all the pollution in Knoxville in the summer, and which tended to flow down these valleys down to the river and then off someplace to the next guy down the river. But at any rate, if you stopped it here with any kind of structure in the middle of this thing, you really were going to asphyxiate half the people in the fair on a good day in Knoxville. So out of that came the idea, well, and then there were a lot of very real constraints in the energy reuse. The energy reuse was so complex, and obviously was a building that was the last 30 or 40 years, that in a sense you had to start this thing by designing the reuse and then finding a way to convert the reuse into a fair for 6 months. And that's basically the way this was done. There were a lot of good reasons in the program why a lot of the energy things wanted to be underground, for access in terms of existing road elevations, and for the type of environmental controls they wanted. And so basically we ended up with the idea that, all right, we'll put this thing as kind of an underground building. You'll have access down the back of it from some giant ramps for the fair, and then at a later date for the reuse, those will become the truck access to all these very complex laboratories. You'll build your kind of generalized underground loft space that the laboratories required, and then zip it up for the fair. And then above ground, you'll do just a very nice small-scale park, a place, lots of places to sit under the trees and against flowers, small-scale kiosks all throughout this where the kind of ad hoc basement inventor could kind of do his thing, one guy a week in each one. Since that was seen as a big problem, given that all the big conglomerates would be exhibiting their whiz-bang energy solutions, it seemed that, and in a sense, if you look at the history of invention and the whole energy thing in this country, an awful lot of it has to do with the basement inventor rather than the conglomerate. And so, having a kind of a crackpot park seemed like a much more pleasant and humane way to deal with some very frightening issues on one level. You'd have street theater, you'd have a lot of things kind of happening, all at a very human kind of one-to-one scale, unlike just about anything else that obviously would happen in this fair. At the same time, and then underground, you'd have your more traditional whiz-bang exhibit. Of course, you still had to, none of those moves solved the question of this thing as a symbol for the fair. The only way out there seemed to be to do the world's biggest billboard, obviously. And we began to work with the idea of, okay, let's just put up this giant thing that will kind of, you'll see all the way up and down the valley. But then what goes on it? I mean, obviously you can have lots of things about information and programmable, changing things. But at the same time, you need some kind of fixed image. And this was a very, obviously, not kind of a half-assed, a very early attempt at doing something that I think, could have been fairly interesting, of trying to combine the whole idea of the renewable resource solution with the typical American home. On the assumption, and the assumptions throughout our kind of thematic design of this thing was that the big thing that really gets people about this whole business is that basically on a very visceral level you feel that your basic aspects of your life are threatened, your home and your car. And you know, what could be more basic to the typical American than those two? And the way to get to people is not necessarily to scare them even worse on the vis-a-vis those two things, but to show what changes they're going to have to make in order to hold on to certain things that they hold dear about those two objects. And since they are very important functional as well as symbolic objects. And you know, so that taking a very conventional looking house and saying that, you know, your house doesn't necessarily have to look that different or be that different in a lot of ways that appeal to you in order to accomplish the things that it has to do if it's going to be feasible to, you know, to have it, given everything else that's happening. So trying to soothe and reinforce at the same time that you educate and change seemed like maybe a better position to take vis-a-vis the federal government, the government at large, than this kind of nothing's wrong one day and scare the devil out of me the next day, which seems to be the way they operate. Next slide. Now, underground in the exhibit itself, again, we were dealing with a space that was designed basically as a laboratory with a lot of temporary subdivisions in a very regular structural system, and came up with a series that you can see on the left and right of kind of an energy history date line as you kind of worked your way down the ramps into this thing, your big movie that you have to have in an exhibit in this day and age. And then your energy midway, which was kind of a Palladian vista down through the middle of this thing with a series of side chapels where each one of the competing government agencies could all yell and scream at each other about how their way is the best. And obviously, as relatively sane designers, you didn't want to have anything whatsoever to do with that process. But at the same time, you wanted to control it and give, you know, some kind of consistent way of at least getting through it, even if you didn't want to look at it. And then finally ending in a big solarium here at the end with kind of the heliostat projecting the sun, and a whole series of images that relate to the whole idea, the whole renewable idea. And then finally a series of interactive games for people to kind of play around with some of these issues in almost a pinball parlor sort of way. Next slide. Now here's another building that again plays with some of these ideas of large-scale communication at the scale of the highway and kind of immense scale sites. This is a little visitor center for the Army Corps of Engineers in Hartwell Lake. Again, a little competition, except the Army Corps is a bit more interesting about their competitions. They pick 3 firms and pay them an awful lot of money each to do a schematic on a 3,000 square foot building that if you paid one firm, you could have had the building done by the time you got through. While you're at it, the function of the whole thing is, of course, they're building a whole series of these all over the country. The basic function is one of trying to convince the public that the Army Corps of Engineers are really the right sort of guys and really are out there preserving everything that we hold near and dear. You can believe that if you want. But once you say accept the job, that's obviously what you're involved in. We didn't win, so we could stand incorruptible in the end. But the idea was picking up on some very indigenous types of buildings that you find in this area of South Carolina. The idea of the farm building with the metal roof, the big scale roof, simple building with big scale roof, with a little help from the Army Corps insignia. Next slide. And then, of course, as part of this, you had to turn your building into a sign system to get you from with a little help from Alan D'Arcangelo, to get you from the highway, off the highway, and to the building. Next slide. And then as you came in closer to this thing, you were dealing, you know, it was really a very simple little building, just a simple little kind of slightly distorted box, the big scale roof, and a pretty big castle, 2-dimensional castle. The idea being that, in a certain sense, this drawing is a bit of a lie, since it is slightly raised in point of view. Really, that given the density of the trees, the idea was that when you were in this close, to a great extent, that thing was lost above the trees, and you were basically just seeing the building that the sign was meant to read at the 3 miles over to the interstate across the lake. Next slide. In plan, it was, you know, a really simple little thing. The only thing that makes these things work is that they offer bathrooms. And that's what basically gets you there. So you put the bathrooms absolutely as the first thing to the right as you come in the door. And then you have your exhibit about how great the Army Corps is and the river basin and all that sort of thing, your little movie and your information for, you know, camping and whatnot, and then you can go on out to the site. So, you know, it's absolutely dirt simple little building that, again, has where the question is one of readability and scale vis-a-vis, you know, this immense scale site. Next slide. And then in section, dealing with some of the ideas, since you had that big roof for scale, rather than the interesting things spatially were basically done by manipulating all that space in rather involved rear illuminated ceilings that allowed you to kind of break down the idea of the kind of classic black box so that you could get objects within the space that were as bright as the objects that you looked at through these giant framed views out from different views from the building, including a really immense one from the movie theater itself. So as you sat down for the movie, you're basically looking out at the lake in a beautiful framed view, and then the screen comes down and you go into the movie and then back to the lake. So the building, some of the exhibit ideas were ones of breaking down, given that exhibits are all artificial by their very nature, you were attempting to break down some of that as artificial barriers and play the real world off against the didactic world of the exhibit. Next slide. Now, that brings us to another whole type of architecture, the duck or the tail and pup in LA. This is probably the most famous piece of architecture in LA, and you see everybody shows this picture, and it's been published all over the world. It's your claim to fame, and you better, I guess you better grin and bear it. And it's basically the idea, of course, being the building, which is totally, whose function is totally distorted by the shape, or the thing, its image, what it's meant to look at. Everything else has to accommodate to that. Now, very few architects get to do these, and it's probably just as well. When we've only gotten to kind of do half of one. Next slide. Oops. Oh, gosh. Something's out of whack. So it's a parking lot with a box in the middle of it, or a ship on top of a box. Oh, there we are. Great. This was a project, and it'll never be built, it'll never see the light of day, I'm sure. But it was a rather interesting client. He was a young guy who made a lot of money in the mid-'70s in Florida and Georgia doing discotheques, kind of a combination of a very shrewd businessman with a very good instinctive kind of feel for what his audience, what appealed to his audience. And he basically asked a group of friends of his, I guess, who was a good architect that he wanted to do a new jazz club in Houston, who he should go to design this for him, and they told him to go to Mitchell Jurgula, so he hopped on a plane and walked into their office one day, and sat down and said, gee, my name's Richmond Smith, and I want to do a jazz club, and I want to do it as a ship in a bottle. And they kind of blinked and said, gee, that's a really nice fella. But we think you came to the wrong place. If you just go out and down a couple blocks and hang a right, you get to a place called Venturi and Rauch. I'm sure they can help you. And that's just what he did. That's just what he did. He walked right out, and they called us up as soon as he left and said, there's maybe this nut coming over to see you about doing a ship in a bottle. We said, well, gee, thanks a lot. That's really great. And lo and behold, 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and in walked this guy, and he says, I want to design a ship in a bottle. And of course, we didn't bat an eyelash. And, and then it took us about 2 weeks to convince this guy to give up the bottle. You know, it was really, that was really hard, because we kept telling him, look, you know, it's really a neat idea, but, you know, we just can't figure out any way to keep the ship from melting when the sun comes out and hits the bottle, you know, and little thing. And this guy really held on to his images and his symbols strong. It was awful hard to tear him away from the bottle, but we finally did. And so we ended up with your basic little irreducible box with a full rig ship on top of it in your prototypical, you know, parking lot along the strip in Houston. Next slide. And I hope, yeah, great. And any place else in the world, this thing, even in LA, this is absurd. But not in Houston, not in Houston. They wouldn't bat an eye at this. This would absolutely be an everyday thing in Houston. Because, you know, the idea, of course, and we never did the drawing to really show it, is you'd come tooling down the ring road around, the 10-lane ring road around Houston, and, you know, here'd be a full rig ship coming at you head on, all lit up at night. The idea being that this thing didn't have to be, could be pretty faked in the sense that it was way up in the air and it would just be lattice and some net, because hopefully you were going to let the wind go through it rather than it sail away. And underneath it, you just had a rather conventional little butler building with a rather elaborate interior. The model for the interior was basically 2 rooms, your bar and your music room. And we used the kind of the 18th century court theater model for the little jazz club. You know, a series of wraparound balconies, a raised performance area in the middle. And then the whole thing, the image of the whole thing became played with another series of images that this guy had and brought to us. He was a quite sophisticated guy for all his naivete in some ways. And he really loved museums, and really, wherever he was, he went to the museums and spent a lot of time. And his criticism of museums in general was one that what he'd love to do is, the trouble in a museum was that you couldn't eat and drink. You know, you couldn't have a hot dog and a beer while you were looking at pictures, or wine and cheese or whatever. He said, you know, what I'd love to have if I was really rich, I'd love to have my own museum where I could have good music, good food, and good drink. He said that would be the end. You know, that would be absolutely satisfy every desire I have. So we said, well, what about, you know, maybe that's maybe that would be a good way to do your club. Why not have it do the whole thing as immense scale rear projections? In effect, this building was about twice as big as it needed to be for the people that he wanted to put in it. And all that extra space was basically poche, where you could project at every major surface. And so he could basically have his art bigger and brighter and better than anybody else's art on the walls and change it every week or however he wanted to. He could even have his tableaus about the Texas Navy. The Texas Navy was his inspiration for the ships all along. When we looked into it, we did some research on it, and it turned out the Texas Navy was 5 leaky ships that the Mexicans sunk in 2 hours in 1870 or something. But, you know, the Texans, only the Texans can raise that type of fiasco to great heights of importance. But, you know, again, it was a series of ideas, a lot of them kind of funny, and obviously he was having fun and we were having fun with this, that, you know, we're dealing with the thing in a context that was certainly appropriate to this place and this type of building, and not that much else. Next. That brings us to the little building, big sign model, another thing that came out of Las Vegas here in a kind of classic 60s McDonald's. Next. And we finally, a year ago, got to do one of those too. This is the not so little building with the world's second largest sign. You guys got the largest. Maybe Houston will beat you someday, but up till now you have the largest, the Hollywood sign. which according to Guinness is the world's largest sign. And this problem was one that a local discount department store guy brought to us. It's the kind of company that basically buys a series of locations, most of them rather suburban, that does a mail order, a catalog sales type of thing like Best Products, and very successfully. They bought this existing building. It was an old shopping center from the late 50s. It was 16 feet high and 1,100 feet long, with one door and no windows. That kind of, it was your absolutely irreducibly awful commercial strip building. I mean, you could not conceive of anything more awful than this thing as a piece of architecture. Their basic charge to us was, what can you do in 5 days to make this look better than it is? It's a great site. We're going to make a fortune on it, but we aren't going to spend a cent to do much other than give it a coat of paint, or if you can convince us to do something a little more than that, maybe. But no matter what we do, in a sense, this thing's going to be very successful just because of where it is. It's still in the city limits of Philadelphia, but out in the greater Northeast, which was the great kind of suburban explosion of Philadelphia after World War II. And, it's absolutely prototypical, long, low buildings set way back from the highway with your big parking lot between the building and the highway. It meets the model. AC units dropped on the roof, really, what can you say about it other than that's what it is? And that's what it's always going to be. So the problem then was, what could you do given that 10 years ago that you'd looked at this and said, hey, there's something interesting about these, and confronted with one, you say, why did you ever say that? For real, but kidding aside, the problem was, you couldn't make it, it was almost impossible to make this thing into something else, because it just was this awful animal. So the question then became, how could we maybe exaggerate what it is within the terms that you would expect to see there, within a vocabulary that you would expect to see there, that we could get through the Fine Arts Commission and the sign code, the last two being pretty critical. That evolved into a whole interesting little story in itself. The upshot of it being that the code, which was basically written in the 50s, it was a good taste sign code to control this sort of awful thing. And it was basically written for kind of a classic Main Street scale, basically 5 square foot of sign for each 1 linear foot of frontage. And that gave you kind of a nice little sign like that down on downtown Philadelphia. But nobody had ever thought about what would happen when you multiplied 5 square feet times 1,100 linear feet. And what you get is 5,500 square feet of sign. There's another little wrinkle. There's another little wrinkle in there that says that you can only have any one wall sign, a wall sign being any sign that touches a wall, and so these just touch at one point. You can only have any one sign that's a maximum of around 1,000 feet. They're trying to cut out this sort of thing. And so what we did was go into the code review and say, we want to erect 5 signs, and the legal total is 5,500 square feet. And we want to erect the sign B, the sign A, the sign S, the sign C, and the sign O. And they said, well, gee, that doesn't make any sense at all. Who ever heard of erecting the sign A? And, or B, or S, or C, or O. And we say, yeah, but it doesn't say any place that you can't. I mean, that isn't a sign. And they had to admit that it didn't say any place that you couldn't. And so we were able to get this passed. And then we were able to get by the Fine Arts Commission, who are still turning over in their grave about this one, because there's a little wrinkle in their charter that says that they have the power of review over every building that's within 250 feet of a city or state highway. Luckily, this building was 253 feet back from the highway, and so that took care of them nicely. We didn't even have to make the presentation, although you kind of were dying to make the presentation for this one, right? And so we got the world's second largest sign, 35-foot high letters, all very legal, and in, you know, of all places, Philadelphia. Next slide. Now, these things are really big. And they aren't cheap either. I'm here to tell you that a 35-foot high letter made out of quarter-inch plate butt jointed cost $20,000 a letter 18 months ago. And you know, so in other words, these just aren't any old trashy letters. An awful lot of time and effort went into the detailing and construction of these letters, and they're really very beautifully put together. And I think, not to be pretentious about it, but I think, you know, some of what you got out of working within the, you know, this vernacular, but exaggerating it, making it a bit more hyper, a bit more architect-y, was something that begins to take on some of the monumental feeling of a great piece of minimalist sculpture. You know, that these things really are just, you really do walk right up alongside them when you walk in and out of the store and come at this thing, so that they do have that kind of, you know, tremendous power of a piece of minimalist sculpture, at the same time that they're just kind of an ordinary sign that's got the name of this company. So that, you know, that kind of combination of having your cake and eating it too, working within this thing, what this thing is. In a sense, you know, but perhaps we were able to make that a non-building. Well, it was already a non-building, but we were able to make it irrelevant that it was a non-building by giving these things the power and the scale that they have. Next slide. Here just a fragment. Obviously these are very attractive to kids with spray cans. The owner loves this thing so much that after the first attack, he stations people 24 hours out here because he just can't stand the idea of his letters being defiled. And in fact, he comes and sits here once a week and watches the sunset on this thing. In his Cadillac, he kind of sits right out there in front of it and sighs as the sun goes down on the world's second largest sign. And to this day, he keeps, every year he calls and says, I'm going to find the site to do the world's largest. Just wait, just wait. So LA, look out. This guy's gunning for you. The next slide. Which brings us finally to, seriously, to the thing that I suppose we've been spending more of our time and effort on in the last 6, 7 years, the idea of explicit decoration, the decorated shed. The model, all these other models, while you might get one chance in a lifetime to do something with them, certainly you don't sustain a whole architectural career on them, I hope. But the idea of the decorated shed, of the simple structure with explicit ornamentation, certainly the kind of the one crucial idea, or at least to us, out of all that work, that seems to hold up and seems to be the one that is really got some kind of life of its own to it. This being the, kind of the prime example of that from the 60s in Las Vegas. And again, one of those objects that 50 years from now, I think everybody, some people certainly will look at as, kind of one of the ultimate expressions of the decorative arts in America in the 20th century. It's now mirror glass elevation. It lasted its 10 years, which is about par for the commercial environment, and is now a good taste mirror glass elevation, proving that the modern has won. Next slide. Now, we've been doing in the last 2 years 2 buildings at least that probably we've put more time and effort into than anything else we've ever done in terms of really trying to do the decorated shed once or twice. And, on the face of it, they look like the absolute dumbest simple design problem you could think of. Again, the classics of commercial box with nothing but a skin on it, and the skin's only a few millimeters thick. But when you get into it, like a lot of simple problems, it proves to be really tough and extremely difficult to do because we really are starting like in kindergarten trying to learn how to do this sort of thing. You're trying to invent an ornamental scale, invent an ornamental technique, deal with materials that you can build and that will last, and meet budgets of these very cheap buildings on top of all of that. And so it's it's an extremely devilishly difficult problem when you get into it. And certainly with Best, where they come to you is, well, you had the site wines here very recently, and the charge with this building was that how many site buildings can you do, that for every one of those that they build, they basically have to build another 10, 15, 20 buildings every year in their expansion. And they need a standard kind of repeatable type of skin. For years they just had a simple brick skin that was either white or red or whatever, depending on the locale. And what they were looking for was a new standard, something easily repeated and mass produced. And so we began to look at this idea, really seriously, of how you do wallpaper architecture, and that's what this is. Because you have literally absolutely no control over this thing. They give it to you. It's a machine for making money, of putting people and goods together. They could care less about your feelings about, quote, making a better space. This thing is done down to the last inch to do what they know how to do very well. And basically your job is purely cosmetic on the exterior. How do you make this rather gross object more acceptable in the kind of harsh commercial landscape of the mall or the strip or whatever it happens to be? And so where, some of the levels of complexity, next slide, that you get into in these things have to do with this whole problem of randomness and repeat. Obviously, this is a repeat process. These things are silk screened and baked. So there's a limit to how many colors you can use, one, and a very definite limit to how many different panels you can have with a different design on them. So basically what you're trying to do is create randomness, because you want the randomness in order to give this thing the scale it has. To give it a graphic scale, it has to kind of deny any architectural or material scale, at least as we were attempting to do it here. At the same time, there can only be about 6 different panels, 6 to 7 actually different silk screens. So you're dealing with a very limited number of variables and trying to create the appearance of tremendous variety, whereas in fact, there's really only about 6, 7 different panels. So you're playing with, there actually are repeats. If you watch the red, you can begin to see the repeats occurring. And then the whole thing, the process that makes it so devilishly difficult is that you're constantly only, and this is a process that a painter, I suppose, is much more used to dealing with than typically an architect is, that you're, the variables, just the subtlest little change of, angling the pattern or trying to get a bleed condition, where things kind of just look like they kind of go off the edge and it looks like a piece of paper blown against the building. All those things are you just work hours and days to get that to work, and then you go turn the corner and you have to start all over again. And so it becomes an extremely complex process more time and just hours and sweat went into these elevations than almost anything else I can think of in the last 10 years. Next slide. As you get in closer to it, I think you get some of the sense of what we were after in terms of the decorated shed and the surface's decoration. Certainly you're playing with the idea of reflectivity. Porcelain is an extremely beautiful and rich material. It has tremendous depth of color, reflective quality to the surface, and staying power. The damn stuff ages unbelievably well, although it's not cheap. And then you begin to get the play of, obviously the cars, juxtapose the reflections in the cars and vice versa, that make this whole thing, I think, become a decorative object. The choice of what the representation is flowers, is very obvious in the sense that, boxes are ugly sitting in parking lots, but maybe boxes that are covered with flowers are less ugly and more acceptable, because who hates flowers? There's nothing new about that idea. I mean, the designers of Kleenex boxes have been doing it for years. That you take a given simple object and you plaster on it something that people find acceptable and pretty. And the operative word there is pretty, which is an operative word that certainly most of us as designers don't feel terribly comfortable dealing with. Next slide. Or again, as you get in closer, you see the scale, the actual scale of some of these flowers, which are, 10 to 12 feet in diameter. And the repeat of the different panels and with the different patterns on the panel. Next slide. Here's another slightly more sedate version of the same idea that was just finished this November in downtown Philadelphia out by the university. It's the kind of your typical, rather very inexpensive, kind of $35 a square foot office building, 4 stories high in a kind of a renewal area that's been totally bombed out over the years. Just great empty sites and kind of big box buildings plopped down all over it. Could be, any suburban or kind of science center or engineering park place, any place in the country, where the idea is that you're building, one has to be very inexpensive, 2 has to be built very quickly, 3 has to be a very simple shape, just big landscape floors, big open floors, basically a big loft building, 4 stories of it like this building, and within which the flexibility to kind of do anything that lends something to the street or something to be seen that has some aspect of prettiness or at least color and liveliness to it is really limited. Particularly if the only way you can articulate this thing is to begin to break up the masses and try to use shadows and whatnot, which would be the more traditional way of doing it, or try to change materials radically, all of which gets you in a lot of problems with the functioning of these things on the interior. Next slide. So that what we did then was just accept the fact that it's a big box with strip windows and brick infill of steel frame. Crank out the drawings, get it under construction in 2.5 months, and then spend 4 months trying to figure out how to make it pretty while it was being built, and which came into this extremely complex process of going back to kindergarten and trying to learn how to deal with value and intensity and the decorative properties of patterning here in this using a glazed brick, 3 colors of glazed brick and in a square 8x8 brick against the reddish field brick, and a series of porcelain panels covering up the columns. Next slide. Which then in toto becomes this type of play of pattern, which has very little to do with what this building is or who's in it in a sense. It has mainly to do with creating something that's kind of visually pretty and interesting on the street to give a little bit more to what is a pretty cruel environment. That's about all that the attempt is, although the execution is really difficult because we really don't know much of how to do these things yet, because we really haven't been trained to do this sort of thing for so long. The flowers showed up again. The 2 buildings were going on at about the same time, and we couldn't think of anything better than flowers, so we sold them twice for the same reason, basically, although they got different color ones. Because you wanted something special at the entrance, again, that was pleasing and pretty as you came into the building. Next slide. Or here in detail. We have problems with our brick walls too. You'd think after all these years we could build brick walls that whose weep joints worked. Next slide. Or again, detail of the entrance with the porcelain panels. This does have the only kind of distinctive feature to it on the interior, since it's just great open floors, is a rather elaborate lobby as you come in. It really hasn't been photographed yet because it's never been furnished and it's waiting for a big mural that goes in it. But then basically the rest of it is just a very ordinary office building. Next slide. This is a rather special thing that doesn't really relate in any really obvious way to that idea of the decorated shed, other than the fact that it is the problem of what do you do with difficult rather undistinguished spaces. This is the new Knoll showroom. It was opened this November in New York. Basically, it's a kind of 50s office building of which they leased 2 floors. A really bad building. The kind of building that if they'd hired you before they signed the lease, you would have told them to forget it, because this thing was a dog. And you just, there was, you know, why should Knoll be in a building like this? But they did, and so your problem, once you accepted the job, was how to make something a bit more distinguished out of a really gross space. You know, kind of 20-foot columns coming down for 20 stories, so you weren't going to do anything about those. They were there for the duration, and so you had an 8-foot ceiling, clear, before you even put the ceiling in it, so you were going to have less than 8 feet clear height in this thing by the time you put any kind of ceiling in it. You know, a really impossible space in which you basically had to do a furniture showroom and fabric showroom and then a system showroom on another level. The only kind of structural exception that was kind of possible was to knock one hole through between the 2 floors in order to get some kind of internal connection. Next one. And at that point, you were left with a very minimal palette to deal with this thing. Basically, your palette was one of color and light, because you sure as heck couldn't do anything spatially to speak of, given the proportions of this floor. And so what we ended up with was, since Knoll is really more in the fabric business than they are in the furniture business now, more of their gross really comes from fabric than it does furniture, was to use the fabric itself to create a piece of sculpture connecting the 2 floors, kind of going up through the hole, do a little trompe-l'oeil work on the entrance wall with the idea of the fabric wall done in as a painting and as an assign juxtaposed to the real fabric wall. Next slide. Looking the other way, pick up an idea from the classic Knoll showroom from the early 70s, a really beautiful room that had the idea of a stage where you every month could have your special furniture exposition of whatever the new model was, and that kind of off to the left with the receptionist, and all of this done very dark to try to then open up into the very light but not dead white, kind of ambiguous white of the main furniture showroom. The curtain walls in the background, which were really awful, but you couldn't change because obviously you had no control over the exterior wall of this building, kind of screened out with a simple wood screen of kind of random slots, and then the whole thing kind of tied back together with the pinstriping around the top. Next slide. Or here in a bit more detail in the middle, where since you couldn't make the columns go away, we made them bigger since they wouldn't disappear. We made it, you know, big fat Egyptoid plaster columns that then became the lighting fixtures for the indirect lighting. And then the cruciform shapes being a kind of half circle, semi-recessed. Couldn't really recess anything in this space, but given the heights of the ceilings, that lit the individual furniture settings. Next slide. There was one room where we could have a bit more fun, and that was the boardroom, which was basically to be the main corporate boardroom, and which we took your standard drop-in rear illuminated plexiglass ceiling and added a little bit of color and scale to it with the help of a Robert Adams ceiling, silk screened, or a Venturi and Rauch version of a Robert and Adams ceiling, silk screened onto the plexiglass panels. Next slide. Giving the whole thing a bit more ornamental scale than a typical, you know, it is really just a typical cheapo drop-in ceiling. And you're kind of hopefully distracted a little bit from that with the help of Robert Adams. Next. Now, we'll wind it up with just just a couple things dealing with this idea of Main Street, bringing all these ideas back to the pedestrian scale, which we talked about in some length this afternoon and won't go into tonight when we analyzed Atlantic City. But the basic idea is being one of, you know, that cities communicate by signs, the word, the appearance of buildings and their style, and the location of objects. That those three major categories account for an awful lot of the ways that we come to understand and use any typical American city. Next slide. You know, and it's just repeated, that lesson repeated again in this little series of pictures from a place like Alameda, where, you know, the civic buildings communicate the fact not by any special location or axes, just another building on the corner, but by, you know, the sign that says City Hall, the arches of the opening, the arcade and classical orders of the high school, the power of the word to make, you know, an awful lot of what goes on in the life or death sense work. And then just, you know, the locational thing of the corner bar and the styles of individual buildings that just give a different message that's read and implied explicitly and implicitly in those styles and those choices of style. Next slide. Or, you know, here, a classic example of this type of architecture, just not, I guess this is just a couple blocks from Pelley's building, I think the Design Center. I forget the name of the street, but you probably all know it. But, you know, representing, again, that era, that probably the last successful era at dealing with this problem of combining space and form and color and representation and ornament in one architectural style to give, you know, kind of communicate and give readability on the typical Main Street. And, you know, I think it just does it very well. And sure, it's been junked up over the years. But interestingly, because it combined such a rich vocabulary of kind of words and color and ornament in the initial one, that, you know, even Mr. Bail Bondsman does less violence to it than, you know, he would do to the typical modern building, perhaps. That kind of rich combination of graphics and form really is what a lot of what Main Street architecture is all about. Next slide. Now, in the last couple of years, we've been doing a series of studies, a lot of which have to do with a lot of social and economic issues that we won't get into tonight, that deal with this whole problem of what is renewal, what is appropriate renovation and reuse on Main Street. This was the first one we did a few years back in Galveston on the Strand, the kind of classic late 19th century wrought iron and brick commercial district of Galveston, which was then, the problem was one of reuse and rehabilitation to some extent. A lot of this has very definite economic things tied up with it, but in which part of the process has to do with educating the people who live there about the nature of these things, and not to kind of overly Williamsburg the thing, not to give it a certain life, to give it a certain quality of one era's signs or one era's decoration and another era's buildings, which, you know, has to do with certain inconsistencies and not over-designing consistencies into situations which basically get their interest out of these contradictions. Next slide. And, you know, and then, I mean, this is just a very small, in a sense, almost superficial part of this type of work, since a lot of it has, is non-visual in its imperatives and has much more to do with process and a process of creating a series of controls. But certainly as one of the end results, you end up, not that we're going to design any of those buildings, we aren't, but you end up by trying to give them some kind of evocative image of, you know, within certain control guidelines of what this thing might look like. It's both part of what